and so forth. But however, unfortunately, they took those things and they also took other things like philosophy, like theology, and they began to bring them into Islam and try to find some balance between the Quran and Sunnah and what philosophers like Aristotle had taught many years before. Obviously, and it should be clear to everyone that there's absolutely no need to do that whatsoever. That this is a grave mistake that we can make. To put anything on a par with the Quran and Sunnah. And begin to say, well, this is what philosophy says, or this is what logic says, and so forth, and let's see if we can somehow make this compatible with what we find in the Quran and Sunnah. And the way to do that, the way many of them did that, was by reinterpreting, or in fact twisting the meaning of the Quran and of the Sunnah. And this led to a development or a school of thought within the Muslim Ummah, which has, by its name it has died, but in fact by its thinking it has still unfortunately existed. And as I said, that situation was not much different from what has occurred throughout the Muslim Ummah in the past couple of 100 years, in which the Muslims, as you all know, and in fact because of their deviation really from true Islam, they had become very weak, they had become behind the rest of the world. So then they began to look at the rest of the world, Europe at that time in particular, or Europe, had advanced, materially had advanced beyond the level of the Muslim world. And the Muslims at that time were, from the point of view of this world, you could call them backwards, or they were behind. So therefore they saw this great civilization, or what they thought at that time was a great civilization in the West. And there, unfortunately, many of them, their approach to that great civilization was the same approach that those earlier people that I talked about had towards Greek philosophy and logic and so forth. That is, they said, look at this great civilization, look what the people of the West are doing, look at what is happening in Great Britain and France and so forth. Why don't we turn to them and try to take from them and learn from them and so forth? If this process is done in a way in which it is guided by Islamic principles, or if this process is done when people are well aware of Islamic teachings, then we can look at the Western world and we can see what is it that the Western world has that we Muslims can benefit from, can actually take from them. And we also will have to recognize what is it that the Western world that we cannot have anything to do with. And we have to make sure that these things do not enter into our beliefs, our customs, and our ways. The physical sciences, for example, or technology and these kind of things, on the face of it, or as a whole, I should say as a whole, this kind of knowledge a Muslim can benefit from and can take. There's no problem with that. However, as I said, when we become so enamored by the Western civilization as what happened in the Muslim world in the past few hundred years, in which we begin now to think that, well, everything must be good from the West. Or we fail to distinguish between what is good from the West and what isn't good from the West. Or we even fail in sciences to distinguish between where, in fact, Western science is wrong and Western science is right. Because every science has its own philosophy. Even if you're a scientist, you should realize that every science has its own philosophy. You may be familiar with it or not, but every science has, in fact, its own philosophy behind it. So what happened is that many Muslims became so enamored with the West that they began to accept and try to implement into Islam almost everything from the West. And in fact, one writer even said that we should take everything from the West, the good of the West and the bad of the West. Because they are so advanced and so forth that we should therefore take everything from them. In other words, he was saying that part of their advancement has to do with their complete culture and their complete way of life. So therefore, if we want to be advanced like them, if we want to catch up with them, we should also take everything that they have. And this kind of thought is continuing among the Muslim Ummah. It has not unfortunately been erased. And one of its facets is really this interfaith movement that many people talk about, where somehow an interfaith movement has many parts to it. Now, I'm not that familiar with the interfaith movement here in the UK, but I'm somewhat familiar with it in the United States. Part of it is where we try to enter into dialogue with the Jews and Christians, and we see where we disagree, and we try to figure out how we can come to some kind of agreement. Personally, I cannot understand why any Muslim who understands what Islam is would ever involve himself in anything like this. If you read the Quran and you read the Hadith of Prophet ﷺ, if you read many verses in the Quran, for example, and in fact, there is an article that I believe is going to be passed out, Islam and the Interfaith Movement. Wasn't written by me, by the way, so I'm not trying to promote my own work here. If you read that article, inshallah, I'll make many points clear to you. And as I said, inshallah, there are going to be copies available of it. We see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the religion of Judaism and the religion of Christianity. And that article, as I said, quotes many verses in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly says that their beliefs, what they believe, for example, about Isa alayhi salam, what the Jews believe, and the attitude towards the religion of the Jews and so forth, it is kufr. It is kufr. Now how would any Muslim who, by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah has guided him through the Quran and Sunnah, has guided him through the straight path, why would anyone who knows that he is on that path, why would he want to compromise anything of his religion? He knows he's following the way and believes in the way that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this must be the goal of the Muslim, to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In every action of our life, every part of our life, we should want to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if we know that this Quran and Sunnah, this is describing the way that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how could any Muslim then go from that point and say, let me see what the Christians and Jews have, maybe I can take some things from them and alter my beliefs and agree with them about some things. This is unbelievable, and from the Sharia point of view, it is completely unacceptable. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes that this is His one path. Follow that one path, don't follow the other path. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the kufr of the different groups, whether it's the mushrikeen, whether it's the Jews and Christians. And yet, unfortunately, some Muslims say, let us enter into dialogue, let us come to some agreement, let us bring our religions together, let us learn from one another. And if this is the meaning of the interfaith movement and dialogue, this, I think, for anyone who understands what Islam is, for anyone who appreciates the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and revealing the Quran and preserving the Quran and giving us that complete guidance, no Muslim would want to get involved in that thing whatsoever. And if to present Islam to the Christians and to present Islam to the Jews and to other groups, this of course is a great deed. A deed which is inshallah very pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But you have to remember that when you're presenting Islam, you are not presenting your religion. You are presenting to them, or you're supposed to present to them, the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You don't have the right to say, we'll give him this much and we'll keep this much, we'll tell him this. We'll have them believe this, and if they want to believe some kufr, that's acceptable and so forth. If you want to make da'wah, you're supposed to make da'wah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're supposed to call to the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that way is the way of the Quran and Sunnah. So if Christians and Jews want to come to us and meet with us and discuss with us to see what is our religion, this of course is good. But even in that case we have to make sure that we are giving them the true religion. And we are not trying to alter it. We're not trying to put it in such a way that it will be pleasing for them and displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course we talk to them nicely and so forth. There's some principles of da'wah. And we want, it is the desire of every Muslim that everyone in the world becomes Muslim. No Muslim should have any reason to wish that someone enters the hellfire unless that person stays and dies as a kafir. We should desire and want everyone to become Muslim. We should desire and want everyone to be worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we must also desire